Kurum, newly appointed Subadar of Yara 6, also known as Eden to its previous inhabitants, surveyed his new domain. It was a lush, green world with a mild climate and abundant natural resources. Even after paying the tithe to the Imperial Chancellor, there would still be plenty left over to develop the planet to Imperial standards. He watched the work gangs of his 60 new human slaves unload the cargo from Kurum's ships, noting their remarkable compliance and lack of resistance. Though he was slightly disappointed by their easy surrender, it meant there were no repairs needed to the settlement, freeing more of his men to sweep the nearby jungle for additional humans and survey the area. Consequently, he sent out a half-dozen three-man patrols in a 360-degree arc. There was something peculiar about the place, though massive concrete walls, seemingly useless against an aerial attack, stood around the settlement. Kurum wondered why they were there, as modern warfare had rendered such walls obsolete, and they appeared too large to be for keeping out animals. Perhaps the walls were there because the inhabitants were so weak. The structures housing livestock and the 3 communal living quarters were also much stronger than the other buildings, each having only 2 doorways with heavy sliding steel doors and steel shutters over the windows. They made excellent prisons, so once they were looted and checked for weapons, it was decided to lock the humans in a single building at night. Strangely, the humans seemed relieved at this announcement. Their compliance also sped up the unloading process, which left Kurum feeling generous when the village leader asked to have supper in their quarters. He allowed them to lock up their livestock and sent all the humans to one of the quarters, using the other buildings for his men. After posting guards near the doors of the newly designated slave quarters, setting up sentries and interior patrols, Kurum returned to his orbiting ship. He decided to stay on board until suitable accommodations were constructed and an interstellar communication system installed in his HQ. Enjoying the view of his new domain, he finished his report to the Imperial Chancellery and transmitted it before retiring to his bedchambers. Just as he was about to fall asleep, the internal call system buzzed, annoying him. Sitting up, he toggled the switch to open two-way communication. This better be good, or someone will be polishing the outer windows without an Enviro suit, he growled. The voice of the ship's captain replied, "Forgive me for disturbing you, Subadar, but there's an urgent call from the surface. Shall I put it through?" Kurum responded, "Yes, Captain. Did they say what the trouble was?" "No, sir. Just that it was urgent," the captain replied. Grumbling, Kurum toggled the mic again. "All right, put them through." A moment later, he heard the voice of his second-in-command, Namsu. "Sorry to disturb your rest, Subadar, but we've lost contact with one of our patrols. I sent out a squad and redirected several patrols to their last known location after an air search failed." Kurum responded with clear annoyance. "That's an appropriate response, but why not wait until morning to inform me?" "Izayadu led the patrol," Sir Namsu replied, which made Kurum sit up. "Izayadu?" "Yes," Sir Namsu confirmed. ICI Adu was Kurum's best sub-officer and the least likely to fail a check-in. If he did, something was definitely wrong. "I'll be down in a moment," Kurum said. It took half a jest to land in the settlement, and he expected updates by the time he left the ship. Namsu met him at the bottom of the ramp, informing him of the current situation. "Subadar Kurum, I regret to report there are no new developments on the patrol." Just then, one of the communication techs ran up to Namsu and, upon seeing Kurum, stopped and saluted. "Did they find them?" Kurum asked. "No, sir," the tech replied. "Then what brought you at a run to interrupt us?" Kurum asked, a hint of annoyance in his voice. The tech took a step back, visibly gathering the courage to speak. "Another patrol has gone missing, sir." Kurum, incredulous, asked, "What do you mean missing? Are you sure it's not an issue with their comms?" Namsu interrupted, "It's not their comms, sir. They were part of the search and just disappeared into thin air. An immediate search of the area found nothing. We now have 2 patrols missing." Kurum exclaimed, "What the hell is going on here?" He turned to the tech, "Have the guards bring the village leader to me immediately." The tech took off at a run, and 2 guards soon approached, hauling the human leader between them. Upon reaching Kurum, they pushed the human to his knees. "What is your name, human?" Kurum demanded. Carl the human replied, "Some of my men have gone missing while exploring the jungle at the base of those hills." "Do you know what happened to them?" Kurum asked. "Reapers," Carl answered. "Reapers, oh. What are those?" Kurum asked, growing frustrated with the human's one-word answers. "Monsters," Carl replied. At the mention of monsters, Kurum laughed, dismissing it as superstitious nonsense. Take him back, he ordered the guards, then turned to Namsu. Call off the search for the night. We'll pick up at first light. Namsu saluted, yes, Sobadar. Checking how much time remained before first light, Kurum decided to return to the ship and try to sleep. Kurum was still asleep when the captain informed him of another urgent message from the surface. Annoyed at being woken, Kurum toggled the switch. What now? Namsu's voice, sounding strange, replied, Forgive me again for interrupting your rest, but it can't wait. Well, what is it? Kurum demanded. We found both of the patrols, Namsu replied. Excellent. Where were they, and what did they have to say for themselves? Kurum asked. Namsu, still sounding odd, answered, outside the front gate. They're all dead. Kurum heard fear in Namsu's voice, which was unusual for his longtime second in command. They had fought many battles together, and hearing fear from Namsu was unsettling. You need to come down immediately, Sir Namsu continued. All right, I'm coming down, Kurum replied. Half a jest later, he stepped off the ramp looking for Namsu, but one of his under-officers was waiting for him instead. The officer saluted, Subadar, Colonel Namsu requests you meet him at the front gate. Kurum noticed the unease in his subordinate's stance but couldn't tell if it was due to addressing his superior or something else. As he passed through the village, he noticed his men seemed on edge. They were all combat veterans, and if they were reacting this way, it wasn't good. Upon reaching the front gate, Kurum was greeted by Namsu, who seemed rattled. Where are the bodies? Kurum asked. We left them where we found them. I wanted you to see them before we moved them, Namsu replied. Show me, Kurum ordered, and they proceeded through the gate. Kurum stopped dead in his tracks when he saw the bodies. All 6 were shrunken and desiccated, their mouths open in a silent scream, and their eye sockets were empty and looked burned out by the wounds around them. Their armor had puncture marks on their upper arms, but otherwise showed no new damage. By the Emperor, Kurum swore. What happened to them? Did you catch any of the ones who put the bodies here? No, Subadar, the bodies just appeared there while the sentry was at the far end of the wall. Namsu replied. Kurum looked at Namsu incredulously. Just appeared. Like out of thin air? No, Subadar, we found some drag marks that led back to the jungle but disappeared after entering it, Namsu explained. Kurum thought for a moment before speaking. Bring the bodies inside and bring that human leader to me. I'll get some answers from him. Despite great reluctance to touch the bodies, they were eventually moved to the village square, currently occupied by Kurum's shuttle. The guards brought the human leader to stand before Kurum. What the hell did this to my men? Kurum raged. The human looked at the bodies, then at Kurum and simply said, Reapers. And what are Reapers? Kurum demanded. Once again, the human uttered one word, monsters. Kurum fought the urge to kill the human but needed to know more. Tell me about them, or I shall start using your people as bait to catch it, Kurum dictated. The human sighed and said, They are some kind of monster native to this world. They feed on the blood, life force, and agony of their victims. They mostly come at night, mostly. They don't seem to die unless the head is separated from the body, but they are fast, strong, and cunning. We've never seen a live one up close, and the only dead one was too badly damaged to see much of it. Is that why you built such high walls? To keep them out? Namsu asked. The human shook his head, to keep our people inside at night. Namsu looked confused. Keep them in. The human replied, The Reapers can't leap the wall while carrying a person. They take their victim somewhere the other Reapers can't steal it while it feeds. Their bite injects them with some kind of sedation paralysis before they grab them. They need them alive when they feed. Alive? Kurum asked. Yes, they feed off the victim's agony as well as the blood and life force. They eat them alive and awake but unable to move, the human explained. So some have survived an attack when the Reaper couldn't jump the wall? Namsu asked. The human nodded. So they've seen them? Namsu queried. The human shook his head. The bite also causes the victim to forget the attack. Do those buildings keep you safe? The ones with animals and where we have you now? Namsu asked. The human nodded again. Anything else, human? Kurum asked before turning to the guards. Take him back and let the rest of the humans out to work today. The guards saluted and went to do as instructed. Namsu looked at his superior. Do we keep the men inside the walls? Kurum looked at him like he was a fool. Of course not. We are imperial soldiers and no one can stand against us. These humans are weak, so of course they think these Reapers are strong, but they are just animals. Kurum continued, I want 10-man patrols looking for these things. At Namsu's questioning look, he explained, the first 2 patrols weren't aware and got caught by surprise, but now that they know what's out there, they'll have more success. Yes, sir, I'll send them out, Namsu replied, but the look in his eyes said he wasn't 100% convinced. The rest of the day was spent having the humans cut wood and construct a tower to place the comms array when it was built. Having found nothing, the patrols began filtering back towards evening, all but one. It finally returned to base, exhausted and short 4 men. The patrol leader, Sub-Officer Atab, was brought before Kurum and Namsu. Seeing the shape he was in, Namsu had him brought water, which Atab drank greedily. With surprising gentleness, Kurum asked, What happened out there? Where's the rest of your patrol? His voice dull with exhaustion, Atab answered, Something or things took them, Subadar. What do you mean something took them? Namsu asked. Atab shuddered. We were working through a part of the jungle near those cliffs pointing in their direction, and we were spread out in a single line. Nobody even heard anything when 2 men at the end of the line vanished. Atab shuddered again. They were just gone. Their tracks suddenly stopped. We combed the jungle for them, but I got the feeling of being watched by something evil. Then what happened? Kurum asked. Then another disappeared, but this time we heard his scream and weapons fire, Atab answered. We ran to the spot and found nothing but his rifle. That's when we heard the laughter, very quiet but malevolent sounding. So we headed back to base in a fast march. We were maybe halfway back when something took the last man in line. This time we heard his scream to help him, and it continued as he was dragged away. Atab shook again. I'm ashamed to say that we all broke and ran at the same time. We ran, and it was like that laughter followed us. We ran until we collapsed and realized the laughter was gone. That was also when we heard the noise from the base and felt we were safe. Atab finished. Thank you, Sub-Officer. You and your men get something to eat and some rest, Namsu ordered. Kurum and Namsu looked agitated. I want double sentries on the wall and 4 at the gate. If the bodies show up there, maybe we can see these reapers, Kurum ordered. I want 2-man patrols walking the village, and I want them on 4 towel watches, Kurum added. Namsu saluted and strode off to carry out his orders. Kurum yelled into the interstellar communication link, I need reinforcements, damn it. By the Emperor, these damn bureaucrats act like it's their own funds. Namsu looked at Kurum. Should we go around them and contact the Emperor? It was his decree that we add this world to his domain. Kurum considered it, not yet. We'll see if High Command can get past those idiots and send reinforcements. Walking out of the communications building, the tension was almost palpable. Over the last 10 rotations, over 24 men had gone missing. Even after Kurum stopped sending out patrols and kept everyone near the base, they still disappeared. Some of them had been sentries on the walls. He was down to just over half the men he had landed with. He brought down the ship's security to reinforce the base, leaving just the 10-man crew on the ship. Kurum regretted sending the rest of his conquest ships back to base after such an easy takeover. Meanwhile, he kept the humans and his men busy turning the village into a real base to operate out of. His shuttle had been making several trips a day, bringing supplies down and taking samples and loot back up. Kurum was exhausted and barely stirred when the tech called his name. He hardly slept anymore. Not only had he lost 5 more men, but for the last 8 rotations, the unseen enemy had been coming to the edge of the jungle and made it almost impossible to sleep. They'd call for the guards to join them, give blood-curdling screams, senseless yelling, roars, whispering, and always that malevolent laughter. The guards would fire into the jungle anytime they saw movement but never hit anything. Kurum no longer sent out men to investigate for signs they hit something. A sentry had fired into the forest and thought he'd hit one. There was a scream, and all the noise stopped, only to continue louder and much angrier. Kurum had sent out a 6-man patrol to follow the blood trail and hopefully find their daytime hiding spot. Only one of the 6 came back, and he reported they'd let him live. They chased after him, and any time he strayed off the path back to base, they herded him back on it. Upon further questioning, he informed them they followed the blood trail to a dead end. It was a trap, and they were caught in it. He'd been knocked into a ravine by something big, so he never saw what happened to his comrades. He just heard their screams and weapons fire, and when he got back to the top, they were gone. Kurum now hoped for news of reinforcements but feared it was much worse. What is it? He asked. The tech replied, Subadar, I regret to report the front gate has been sabotaged. Kurom sat bolt upright at this news. What? How? The tech replied, when they slid the gate open at first light, it fell off its track inside the wall. We are trying to extract it, but no luck so far. Cursing to himself, Kurom got up and told the tech, if he doesn't already know, inform Namamsu to meet me at the gate. The tech merely replied, yes sir, and cut the connection. He dressed hurriedly and strapped on his sidearm. He'd only recently started wearing it full-time when awake. He'd given orders that his men were to be armed at all times. It was only a matter of moments for him to reach the gate. His second-in-command was waiting for him. We can't get a hold of it enough to at least pull it closed, Namsu reported. He followed up with the obvious, we'll never keep them out now. Do we evacuate or keep trying to block the opening somehow? Kurom thought and then ordered, evacuation is a last resort measure. Take the humans, tear down unnecessary buildings, and construct the sturdiest barricade you can. Namsu looked at the buildings. I hope we have enough to reach as high as the walls. Some of the humans were sent to cut more trees at the jungle edge while the rest tore down several buildings for scrap. A pair of screams marked the disappearance of two of the humans. After that, both the humans and the guards were brought inside to work on the barricade. They made it as sturdy as they could, but everyone was still nervous. Kurom ordered 1/3 of his men to occupy the fortified quarters and for the humans to be put with their livestock. He also placed several guards in with them to keep them calm. The other 2/3 were spread out on top of the buildings with a clear line of fire at the barricade. Anything that broke through would meet a fusillade of weapons fire. He thought about just forting up for the night, but not only did that go against his warrior code, it also left them trapped in the buildings. He left Namesu in charge for the first part of the night. He'd take the second half. The troopers would be rotated out, so there were always 2/3 on watch. The noises from the jungle began just after dark, right on time. Kurom had just come out to relieve Namsu when something hit the barricade hard. That noise instantly brought the troops to high alert. Kurom told Namsu to wake the rest of the men and get them ready. This time, a pair of loud thuds came from the barricade. The calls and laughter sounded closer and closer. They were coming. Soon, there was numerous pounding on the barricade. Kurom was tempted to fire through the barricade but worried it might weaken it. But there was a nagging feeling he'd forgotten something. Screams and weapons fire reminded him what it was the walls. They weren't meant to keep the Reapers out but to keep them from escaping with victims. They were inside the base. His men panicked and began shooting indiscriminately. He watched in horror as the communication device was destroyed. The men lost all discipline and even shot their own comrades. Kurom had to hit the ground to avoid such a fate. Several fires broke out, but he had no idea how. That gave him the first glimpse of his foe, even if just silhouetted against the fires. They were tall, bipedal, and had 4 arms that they sometimes used to move faster. He ran to the building where the rest of his troops were staying when he tripped over the body of one of his soldiers, his throat ripped open. He began to run, realizing this attack was different. They weren't just going to take a few of his men, they were going to kill them all. He reached the building, entered, and slammed the door shut, bolting it. He turned around and noticed the slaughter blood on the walls and floors, several of his men dead, and the other door slightly opened. He ran to shut it and tripped over the body of his second-in-command, or at least his head. The firing began to decrease, but he didn't think it was intentional. His men were falling in droves. He remembered the shuttle and made a break for it, yelling for his men to follow, but no one else made it, and the pilot was not aboard. The shuttle. He closed the hatch and entered the cockpit, using the shuttle radio to inform the ship's captain he would be using the autopilot to rendezvous with the ship. A noise behind him caused him to turn and find a large beast standing before him. He couldn't take his gaze off those blood-red eyes. After the firing had died down, the door to the livestock pen opened, and several humans exited the building, carrying their former captor's weapons. Carl looked around warily before nodding to his companions. They spread out, looking for surviving guards. Carl ignored a Reaper feeding on a soldier and entered the building where they were kept before. Carl reached under a bunk built into the wall and pressed a button. A well-hidden trapdoor retracted under the bunk, revealing numerous weapons. Carl's people began taking them and heading out on pre-assigned assignments. A dozen headed for the shuttle, which also contained a communication device. Carl picked up the handheld device and spoke into it, Command, Alpha Base. A voice came over the speaker with a reply command, Go ahead, Alpha Base. Mission completed. Recall the Reapers once they are done feeding and send in 2nd platoon, Carl replied. Understood, the voice replied. While on the comm set, one of Carl's men came over and whispered in his ear. Another voice came over the speaker. Well, Captain, how'd it go? The test exceeded our expectations, Colonel. The cranial implants were a success with only one negative report, Carl continued. One of my men informed me it looked like we temporarily lost control of one of the Reapers in Barracks 3. At least 10 dead, but we'll need to put the pieces together to be sure. Survivors? The Colonel asked. We took 4, including their commander. The Reapers weren't big on sparing them without direct control, Carl replied. The Colonel replied. We bagged about a half-dozen prisoners from their patrols. One group stumbled into a pack of wild Reapers, though. Poor bastards had no chance, and no one escaped. What about the ship overhead? The Colonel inquired. I sent a dozen men and the Alpha Reaper up there. Should get word of its capture any time now, Carl answered. Excellent, Captain. We'll interrogate our prisoners and find out who they are and where they came from. Convey my compliments to your men. There'll be commendations in their files, and I'll personally push for your promotion. Carl, the Colonel finished, taking a more relaxed tone. Thanks, Matt. I'm just glad Deakins and Watts made it to you. I couldn't be all humble for much longer, Carl replied. The Colonel's chuckle came over the speakers before he replied. As soon as the battlefield is ready to be handed over to 2nd platoon, come on home. I've got 3rd and 5th to escort their Reapers to their pens.